here we are. Do I continue or would you like the honors? I will officially let you do the honors of introducing our video today.
That's okay. I'll take it from you. It's all you. Go ahead.
You sure?
Yeah.
All right. Welcome to Online with OnPoint, episode 11. We are on 11, right?
Great job.
Okay.
Welcome back, guys. We are in week 3 of our family series, Atypical. And what does atypical mean?
Atypical means not so typical.
Exactly. It means that we're all a little crazy, especially in our families. And so...
Well, we're a little crazy just besides the family. I mean, yes, family adds the little extra bit of crazy, but if you were to remove family away from the situation, you're looking at two crazy people here.
It's a very, very valid point. Yeah. But for week 1, we focused on Adam and Eve, and we focused on how, even throughout that, we focused on Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, and through their story, how God still used them. For week 2, we talked about the story of Abraham and Lot, as well as, just the power of praying for your families, and how Abraham prayed for Lot when they were apart. And so we are moving on to week 3, and that is changing our focus into tough conversations.
Yeah, so, I think as we've been looking into this series, and you know that we've just shared the last few weeks of how much we actually love talking about families, one of the most challenging aspects of not just families. This is really any relationship, right?
Yes.
I think the first week was great for us to understand that, we all belong to atypical families. I don't know that there is such thing as a typical family, especially today. But then even further than that, to understand that within our imperfect nature, our imperfect families are not so typical family. God continues to use that. And then our thing again with prayer last week, but this week specifically, we're engaging in a conversation that's tough in itself because we're talking about that of tough conversations. And with anybody that's in a family, which we're all a part of a family, good or bad, or what that family looks like, or how many people are in that family may vary. But we've all engaged in some form of a tough conversation in family. And so we're going to have a conversation about that today. I will say this, because I think all of this, we're pushing towards our understanding of how we maneuver through our relationships that we have within our families. But I would venture to say and venture to argue that every single one of these weeks really could speak into any relationship we have. Prayer is not just important in our families. We saw how it impacted family with Abraham and Lot. But the reality is, prayer impacts any relationship we're in. And just like we're going to talk about today in the story of Jacob and Esau, of what I've challenged you guys, where we see a tough conversation taking place and how God uses the tough conversation in confronting that. And this really, what we want to talk about today and what we want to challenge ourselves with today is a conversation about how we effectively lead through tough conversations regardless of the relationship that we're in. And the reason I want to preface it that way is we are in a week where we have just come out of some pretty scary things. We've witnessed and seen police brutality. We've seen protesting, and we've seen every side of the spectrum of how that's being communicated and conveyed, with people's biases and opinions and thoughts on the matter. But the reality is when we face a societal issue, something that is so close and near and dear to all of our hearts because we all belong to this society, we have to understand that even within the midst of everybody having their own opinions, right? Especially when we talk about a unity. Unity is one of our core values here. the reality is that unity is not uniformity. Uniformity kind of says we all want to look, think, talk, act the same. Unity is about kind of overcoming our differences and being able to live, breathe, work, and love one another well within that experience. And so what we're talking about today is how do we have those effective conversations in a culture, in a climate, and in a society where tensions are high. And so we would be remiss if we didn't just even mention kind of the things that have happened this week. But I think it's interesting how this conversation fell on this week following the events that have been happening in our own city. It's it's happening here in Louisville. I think there's deeper conversations and prayer that go along within that. But again, we just want to kind of introduce that this thought as we're talking about Jacob and Esau this week is effective. Is what we hope to communicate is that how do we have effective conversations when it's tough? And I think that factors and goes into every relationship. So, Gia, I don't know if you had anything.
I completely agree with that, and I think that you did a really good job in saying that throughout this time there are these difficult circumstances that our city is in, that our nation is in currently. It's not about being right. It's not about this or that. It's like you said, it's about unity, and the only way that could happen is if we can listen, if we can try to understand, because at the end of the day, it's not about whether we share experiences. It's not about whether we've gone through the same thing, although that may help. It's not about that. The biggest thing within that is knowing that we have other people that are going to love and care for us and support us, even if they don't agree with us, that they're going to love us and pray for us and try to understand our different points of views.
Yeah. And that's what being a part of a community is. And really, that's what being a part of a family is, right? Because as you guys know, and as we know, when you belong to a family, you have the crazy aunts and uncles. You have the crazy cousins. You may be the crazy cousins. We were the crazy cousins. Yeah. And so, families are made up of unique circumstances and situations and people, unique personalities. And that's the beautiful thing about family. There's something that is deeper that unites family. And so, we're going to talk a little bit about some things that you mentioned in there. I was hoping you didn't go too far in, which you didn't, which I think is good, but because I think a lot of what you said is going to help us lead into our conversation today. So, like we said, we're in week 3, talking about not so typical families having these tough conversations, and we're in the story of Jacob and Esau. So where we pick up and what I've actually challenged you guys to read quite a bit today in regards to the story of Jacob and Esau, and partly is because the story takes place over chapters within Genesis, but this is a story that you don't want to miss out on the details of because of the context of the story. And so Jacob and Esau they're the sons of Isaac, who is one of the sons of Abraham. So last week we talked about Abraham and Lot. Later in Abraham's life, there's the whole story of how Sarah was told that she was going to give birth to a son, and they kind of laughed about it because she was old and couldn't have kids any longer, and God gifted them a kid. And so, part of that was Abraham had Ishmael, and then with his relationship with Sarah had Isaac. And it's through Isaac that he has 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. Now, Jacob and Esau are brothers, but what's interesting in Scripture is it actually talks about, and I always found this pretty fascinating, is that it says that Isaac loved Esau, Rebekah, Isaac's wife, loved Jacob. And so, as parents and being a part of a family, you always say you're never supposed to have favorites. And I think as kids, we always argue of like, who's the favorite child or grandchild. My grandma used to say like, oh, you're my favorite grandson, because I was her only grandson. And I would always correct her and say, no, I'm your favorite grandchild. And she was like, I'm not allowed to say that, right? We're not allowed to pick favorites. Well, here in this story, we kind of have a story of favorites, right? So there's the relationship with Esau and Isaac and the relationship with Jacob and Rebekah. Now, Jacob and Esau are twins, but Esau came out of the womb first. That was huge of importance in that time, and understanding that they had a class structure and a system where your oldest son would inherit that of the family and of the father. So all the wealth, all the status, all the land got passed on to the first of the next generation when it came to the sons. And so Esau, beating Jacob out of the womb, actually, just by birthright, had the full inheritance that would have been gifted to him just because he was born a few seconds earlier. Now, as the story progresses, Rebekah, because Jacob is her favorite, wants Jacob to inherit the birthright that belonged to Esau. So later in Isaac's life, Isaac was old, couldn't see, and so Esau went out to go. He was a hunter and a gatherer, so he went out to hunt, to gather and prepare a meal that was one of Isaac's favorite. While he was out, Rebekah had planned and planned this trick on Isaac to where she prepared Isaac's favorite meal. They dressed Jacob up in these, hairy clothes that, because it said that Esau was a very hairy, woolly man, and so. But because Isaac couldn't see, all he had to do was fill. And so that's what they did. So while Esau's out doing an errand and a chore and a favor for the father, Rebekah and Jacob kind of swoop in. And in that moment, Isaac actually places and blesses his birthright upon Jacob, thinking it's Esau. And so this deception takes place. Esau comes back. He's like, "Here, Dad, I'm back." And he's like, "Well, wait. Who was I talking to before?" And he's like, "Well, that was Jacob." And he's like, "Well, sorry, I've given my entire inheritance and birthright to him, although it belonged to you." So, as you can imagine, in that situation, Jacob and Esau have a falling out. I would be pretty mad and angry and frustrated if my younger brother took my inheritance away from me. Because of manipulation and deception. And it's because of that actually, through Esau's anger, Rebekah had commissioned Jacob, "Look, Esau may kill you. Like, this is how serious this is. You need to run, like, just for your own well-being in your life." So he does that, which is where, if you fast forward the story, years later, right? Years have passed. They've gone on and started their own land, their own nations. They've gone on and become married and had their own families and their own children. And it's in those years that Jacob actually moves into and traveling through Esau's land, where they are met face to face once again years later after the fact. And that's where we're going to kind of stop our story and focus a little bit on. And again, I would encourage you strongly to read this, and we'll kind of tag back and forth into the story throughout what we want to communicate within you guys, with you guys about the story, about how we can have these tough conversations effectively. And so, what are your thoughts? Just first, before we really jump into the context of, like, when you hear this story, and I know we've heard this story before, but just initial reactions. You have siblings, you have a family. Like, what would this look like?
I think what makes it really hard, especially in this specific story, is that and why, like, that understanding of Esau's anger is the fact that, this is something that Esau's been looking forward to his entire life. This is something that he's known, that I was firstborn. I was born into a family where my father has promised to me, because I'm sure they've had these conversations. If we know, and within the story, that Isaac has had these conversations with his sons, and Rebekah's had these conversations with Jacob, they know, like, Isaac is going to give Esau the birthright. Like, that's just part of what life looks like right now. And so I think that, Esau not having any idea, like not just going out to please his father and to support him and take care of him, just like a normal day, and then come back to find out that your world has been flipped completely upside down. Because I think, especially in these times, that birthright was setting you up for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
Like that was the like leading
that was your
you.
future.
Exactly. And so like, I can only imagine just the anger and the frustration, I think is where it's like my life's just been flipped upside down. Like all the things that I've been planning, and this is how God works. Like God does this each and every day in everyone's lives. But I think it's harder to see that and to understand that when you're in it, especially when it comes from someone so close, like your sibling.
Oh yeah.
Like your own brother.
This is supposed to be your brother, your
someone
twin.
Who's gonna be with me and support me and love me, and that we were raised together. Like I think that's why it hurts probably even more than someone else doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that's the story, and so. Like I said, years later, they're actually confronted and kind of have this situation, and this is where I want to talk. So I want to switch our conversation to a few points that we want to make that we've just felt not only in this story but just through our experiences. Have you had to have tough conversations with your family?
Definitely.
Probably
Definitely.
more than you wish to have had.
Obviously, those tough conversations mainly happened when I was doing something that I wasn't supposed to, which led to me getting in trouble and having, my parents were really good at explaining and like saying like, you're in trouble because these are the consequences of this and this. It was never like, you're in trouble, go to your room, we're never going to talk to you, but like explaining like, this is why you're in trouble. Like you knew you weren't supposed to do that. You like intentionally disobeyed a direction. But outside of that, if I wasn't in trouble, a lot of those other big, like my family and I have always had a very open communication. The communication that wasn't, that when we didn't want to talk, it was because like of our own doing. Like my pride would get in the way or my guilt or whatever, and I would try not to share with them. But outside of that, like we were always open about things going on within our lives, about our friendships, and about things that were bothering us. And I come from like my mother has always been very blunt and very honest, and when I was younger I didn't understand or appreciate it, but now I can understand and appreciate why she said and did the things that she did, because it's prepared and helped me be who I am today. And so like we've had those tough conversations, we've cried through those tough conversations, but we've always made it through, knowing that we're going to talk about this to try to work through it because we love each other.
Yeah. It's interesting you kind of lead with that and things, too, just knowing your family and how close you are with your family. I'm close with my parents, close with my family, but in saying that, I grew up in a family that was not great at communication. We weren't. It was... we didn't like to have the deep conversations. Now we do. We've grown through some of that, and we've matured in some of those, and we've had some tough conversations that have led us there. But man, when I was in high school specifically, there were some, I think because we didn't have the experience of having those tough conversations, because we didn't have just great communication to begin with. When we had to have those tough conversations, we didn't know how to handle it. And so we had very ineffective, tough conversations, a lot of which would lead to screaming and shouting and anger and frustration, and punching of things, not of one another, but of, pillows and couches and thrown remotes and walls and those types of things, of letting emotions get out of control, which would eventually lead into like, not speaking to one another for months on end. And there's been several occasions with, parts of my family where we just haven't spoken. And even with my own father, as much as I hate to say that, because I really love my dad, is there have been some not so great moments on our behalves, and mainly through some of my stubbornness and my immaturity at the time. But it would lead to like literally 6, 7, 8 months at a time with us just not speaking to each other. And now that I have the relationship that I have with my dad now, I couldn't imagine going 6 months without speaking to him. But man, at that time, I mean, we just were ineffective at having these tough conversations, which is why this conversation around it is so important to me, because man, those are months that I can't have back. You know, like those are times in my life where it doesn't matter if you have regret or, you know, the oh, I wish I would have done things different. You can't change the past, right? So the reality is, you know, how do we learn from that? How do we move forward? And I think where we sit now, and we've had to have tough conversations in our marriage, within our relationship, we've had to have tough conversations with our parents from within our marriage and from within our relationship and those types of things. And so, you know, these, you know, kind of the next few things that we want to talk about and address again, I think are just great for any relationship that you have within having those tough conversations. And so we'll jump right in. So the first point I wanted to make, which I think is huge as we read the story of Jacob and Esau, is you get to Genesis 32. And again, years have passed. They both have families of their own. And Jacob knows that he is about to enter into to the city in which Esau and his family live. Because of that, he knows, and Esau knows what's coming. Now, Jacob, in his mind, understands that Esau has every right to be angry at him still, years later. So he's kind of has this expectation of, man, Esau he has the right to be angry. He has the right to...
And I think in situations like that, it's so easy to let our mind wander to a worst case scenario. Yeah. Like, okay, I'm going to do this. He's going to kill me. Like, Esau's going to kill me. I'm not going to make it out.
And it doesn't get much worse than that.
Yeah, exactly. Like, that's the worst case scenario.
That's literally the worst case
scenario.
But
I think even just of conversations with family, like, they're never going to talk to me again. Yeah. I'm going to be grounded for the rest of my life. Yeah. Like, those are all things that that are common emotional thoughts when we're entering and preparing to have these conversations.
Yeah. And the word you just said there is preparation, right? And so, you know, I think the first point that we want to make within this is when you get to Genesis 32, what you read is Jacob preparing Esau for this conversation and for this face-to-face interaction. And so what Jacob actually does through this story is he actually sends people into the city to bring gifts to Esau, you know, kind of as this like this you know, just to patch things up type of deal. And you know, I think deeper than that, you know, I think maybe the intention of it is good, or you know, whatever, but the intention really from it is Jacob wanting to prepare not only himself but also preparing Esau's heart, which I think is huge when we understand, man, when we enter into these tough conversations, let's not enter into these tough conversations unprepared. I think that's important for both parties in this, is that, man, it took preparation from Jacob's part and preparation from Esau's part. And I'm sure, you know, this is one interaction, but I'm sure, you know, when you go years and years of silence without communicating, I'm sure you've walked through this scenario multiple times in your head. Man, if I ever had an opportunity to see Esau again, you know, I would love to tell him this. Or, hey, I know Jacob did this to me, but man, he's my brother. I would love to have, but you know, you have, you know, pride that creeps in and you know, distance that creeps in, and just years of, again, kind of that emotional roller coaster. But man, how important has preparation been in your experience of tough conversations?
I mean, I think it's valuable, especially for someone like me, because usually when I enter into conversations, my emotions are usually the first thing that take over. And my emotions aren't always valid. Not that they don't matter, but when I react emotionally, it's always very selfish. And I think that's the same for everyone, because when we react emotionally, it's about ourselves, and we don't enter in ready to listen. And so preparing for those things and understanding, like, I need to go in there like saying what I want to say, but also not overtaking a conversation before it could start. And so usually if I'm not prepared, my emotions take over the conversation, and it becomes an ineffective conversation. And so I feel like this preparation, although you're like, oh, how am I supposed to prepare for a conversation when I don't know what this other person's gonna say? It's you preparing yourself for how, not only what you're gonna say, but how you're gonna react.
Yeah, I think one is preparation does limit our ability to react, because I do think reaction has a danger. I don't, again, within some of this, I don't think preparation is solely tied into what we're going to say or what we're going to do. I think part of it is preparation of your heart.
Of course.
Right? And part of that preparation means humility. It means patience. It means forgiveness. It means, so that means you're soaking this in prayer. You're being intentional in that thought and that solitude. And this is with any interaction that many interactions that we read in the Bible, is the best conversations and best interactions come after that of silence and solitude, that of, especially in Jesus' ministry. There was so many interactions of Jesus that were a direct result of how he had prepared himself to do it. Most of the miracles he had and that he had done took place after he had sought the solitude and the silence and the prayer, the one-on-one time with God, his Father. And I think that's huge, is preparation. I don't always feel have to be, what am I going to say? What am I going to do? What if he says this? I think that's maybe part of the thought. But man, if that's included in part of your prayer, I think that makes it even stronger. So I think preparation is key, but preparation soaked in prayer is really where we find the piece of this that is like so valuable when we enter into these tough conversations. Because the reality is, when we enter into a tough conversation, we know it's going to be tough, which means things could be said that we don't like. Things could be said that trigger emotion, that can trigger a reaction. And if we haven't entered into that prayed up, then we allow our fleshly nature, our human nature to sneak in. And that's where we can have that anger, that bitterness, that frustration to take over as a reactionary result of something that's said or something that's done. And when we lash out, then all of a sudden our voice is no longer heard. Right? So I think that's just a big piece of this, as we understand it, is, man, as we enter into these tough conversations, preparation is key. And a big part of preparation is soaking it in prayer. So, any additional thoughts as far as preparation, prayer?
No.
So there you go. So which leads me, as I think this is something that you've already mentioned several times throughout this, and I think this may be, I mean, prayer preparation. I think all of these maybe are just as important, but maybe this one specifically for me, because this is sometimes the one that I struggle with the most, is that of listening. I think in order for us to have effective tough conversations, we have to have the ability to listen. And when I say listen, I'm not talking about this idea of listening for the response, right? I think it's so easy in these tough conversations of like, I'm going to listen to you to see how I'm going to respond to you.
Yeah.
Instead of just, I'm here to listen.
And I think it's so vital to say that, and even within our nature and our society. I went to a training where the exercise was to like observe and just listen. Like, I wasn't allowed to say anything as someone talks to me about something that's important in their life. And I remember how hard it was, like, to make it seem like I'm acknowledging what they're saying by making even just little comments like, oh yeah, that stinks, or oh, I can't believe that, or just those little comments that make them stop their communicating. But even as you're talking and as you're listening to them talk, you're realizing that you're not preventing them from saying things that they want to say. Because I think when you're making even just little comments that you may not think is a big deal, that's delaying their thought process and preventing them from continuing their story. Because they're like, oh, maybe that person's trying to say something, so I'm going to stop. And so I think that, like he said, obviously, preparation, prayer are huge aspects, but when you get to that point where you're ready to listen, to really truly listen, like, don't talk, for until that person is done completely stating their view or their point, or whatever that they are trying to share with you. Like, let them complete that entire thought before you respond. And I think that's part of even just preparing, like knowing that I don't need to dominate a conversation, which was very difficult for both of us, because we're both very dominant speakers in any conversation.
Yeah, very vocal. And wanting our opinions to be heard.
Oh, for sure, of course. And so I think that sometimes we let our own stubbornness and pride get in the way of that when it comes to listening, because we're like, oh, if I don't say anything, I'm not going to be heard. But in these really tough conversations, it's not about you always being the one that needs to be heard. And so I think it's super important to make sure that you are allowing the other party or the other person or the other family member, whoever you're in this relationship with, to communicate effectively and uninterrupted.
Yeah. I think that's huge. I think because a lot of times we think, I want my voice to be heard. Mm-hmm. And when we enter into a conversation with that, sometimes it can blind us from the reality that there's another voice at the table. And so when we don't allow ourselves to listen, that removes that voice, which is a valid voice. I mean, that's it's their story. It's their reality, it's their point of view, and it's their voice. And I think it's dangerous when we remove other people's voices. And so within that, though, I do feel like so much of this and what listening and the value of listening is I think listening allows us, and listening leads us into empathy. Which empathy is the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. I think because the person you're sitting across the table from when you're having these conversations is a life that you've never lived. And so what listening allows you to do is actually have empathy for that person, hearing their point of view, hearing their story, which then can actually lead you into a place where it almost actually puts you can start seeing the situation through their eyes. And I think that opens up our heart, opens up our mind to thinking, wow, I can definitely see where they're coming from. I can definitely understand that. I don't think it always necessarily means you have to agree with it. But man, I think the inability to listen makes us have the inability to have empathy. And I think I don't think, just from my experience, when we don't have empathy, we can't lead with compassion. And when we're talking about, especially us as Christ followers, we're following a Christ who exemplified compassion. And compassion literally means to suffer together. And in that, in order for us to suffer with that person across the table, we have to not only have empathy for that person, but it has to be led through how we're listening. So I would just lead with that too, of like, preparation of prayer is key, but preparation and prayer can lead us into becoming better listeners, which then gives us a better perspective, and humility, which I think is maybe where, did you have something else you wanted to share? Because I was going to lead from that maybe into like point number 3, is how do we, I think in order for us to have effective conversations, it takes humility. Preparation, prayer, listening, humility. Do you want to maybe touch on that a little bit?
And I think that, even just going back to the story of Jacob and Esau, and as he was preparing, he knew he did something wrong. He knew he was humbly able to say, Esau, I am unworthy. And I know it says it in Jacob's prayer, as he's praying to God, he says that I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have showed your servant. And he's calling and praying this out to God, but also knowing that like he feels that, like, I know that there's that hurt and that pain of what he did to his brother, because he's fearful of how his brother is going to react. And so within that, like that humility, that being able to admit, I am unworthy, or that I'm not enough, but knowing that we have a God that provides, and tells us differently. But he does that for everyone, not just us. not for just me, not for just Justin, but for all humanity. And I think that it's so vital to see that and understand that, because at the end of the story, the relationship with Jacob and Esau, it is a beautiful, happy story. I mean, if you go into
33.
33, it talks about how they just wept. They ran. Esau ran to Jacob and they embraced and they wept. And it's such a beautiful description of what forgiveness looks like, and what, even just that preparation that Jacob took into meeting his brother, even after, all of that. And that in itself is humility. Yeah. Going back, like, that's not an easy decision. Like, I'm sure for Esau, or for Jacob, it wasn't like, oh, I'm gonna go check out my brother and see how he's doing. He's probably gonna forget about it. Like, that in itself is probably heart-wrenching and super humbling for him to know that I'm gonna go back to this brother who I betrayed. And so I think humility is such a vital aspect within having these real hard conversations.
Yeah, I think humility is huge too, because it begins to put things into perspective. I think that the human nature and the human tendency for us is to care about self, and that's no secret. That's the culture and the society we live in. We're a me culture, where all the decisions we make, our political decisions, our educational decisions, our relational decisions, the things that we buy, the things that we say, that a lot of what culture and society moves us towards is me. How can I make decisions that benefit me? How can I be in a relationship that benefits me? How can I vote for someone or that benefits me? Whereas what so much of Scripture does, and what Jesus does, is he flips that and says, no. We're called to love your neighbor, to pray for those who persecute you, to love your enemies well, to love those who are sitting across the table. And in Jesus' case, it doesn't matter if they're a Samaritan or a Gentile, or those who are stoned or are killing him. It's even that's that last interaction when he's hanging on the cross is he asked his God to forgive those who are killing him. Like, Jesus was never about self. And I think that's why there's so many scriptures that speak into our ability and the way that we experience God's blessing through our humility. Right? It's I don't know. It's just about putting other people above yourselves. And when we do that, it's so fascinating to me how it changes the direction of those tough conversations that we have. And I think that's just so powerful. Do you have anything to add to humility? Because I know I don't want to, this stuff I think we could talk about forever. I want to end with this point. So what have we done? We've done preparation and prayer. We've done listening.
And humility.
Humility. I thought there was something in it, but no, you're right. All right, so the point number 4. I think is this, and I'll just say with one word: love. I think with any tough conversation, any relationship, any interaction, when we lead with love, again, I think this is just compounded on deepening and furthering our understanding of humility. But man, I think there's something, again, with how we understand love and when we lead with love, that has an opportunity to put us in a position where it becomes, this relationship is more than me being right. It's more than my voice being heard. It's more than no. It's
more than me.
Yeah, and so that's why I think it's compounded on top of humility, because I think humility allows us to love better, and I think that's huge. And so, what would you say to that? Just, I mean, even in our experiences of some of these tough conversations is, and we've had, and I think part of this, sorry to cut you off, I just had another thought, but I think in our experiences and in my experience personally with tough conversations, it's possible to love people well who don't agree with you. I think that's something that is difficult and hard in our culture and our society, is sometimes we feel, because we want to surround ourselves with like-minded people, because sometimes that's easier. It's easier to live a life when you're surrounded by people who think like you, talk like you, and so it's a little more difficult when we have to kind of deepen those relationships and deepen our love to understand and hear and lend a voice to those who maybe don't think like us, and that happens a lot in family. I mean, just even in some interactions with our family is but within that is we still have a love for them, and we still want God to bless them and be a part of their life. And I think, again, back to where we kind of started in this, is I think that's the story of unity. Unity was one of Jesus' core missions on this earth. Even one of his prayers right before he's arrested in John 17 is it was a prayer for unity, for his name to be known because of the unity that the church would carry itself with. And I think that's huge for our families too, in any relationship we have, that in order for us to have unity, it's not about who's right, who's wrong. It's not about, and part of that, like we said earlier, it's not about us all looking, thinking, acting, saying the same things, having the same opinions. No, unity means I love you regardless. We have a God that loves us unconditionally. That means it's a love without condition. It doesn't matter the color of your skin, your economic status, the sins you've committed, the people you've wronged. God loves you. And I think that's just such a beautiful thing, when we can lead by the love that God has gifted us. There's something about how we can have those tough conversations differently when we lead with love rather than leading with selfishness or frustration, anger, resentment. I don't know, but anything you'd add to that?
I mean, I think he's said it all. Especially after a week like this, there are going to be hard conversations. There's going to be discomfort. There's going to be, if you haven't already felt it, frustration, anger, sadness, confusion, loneliness, feeling like you don't know what to do. But I think when we walk into conversations with others, it's important to go through those steps of preparing yourself, praying about it, listening, and then just being really humble within your responses. Because at the end of the day, like he mentioned, like God brought Jesus here to save us, and Jesus came here and was just overflowing with love for us, and begging for unity within our lives, but also just knowing that he didn't come here to be comfortable. And I believe that he didn't bring us here to be comfortable. He didn't bring us to be surrounded by people who believe and think and do everything that we do. Because that would, what fun would that be? And so I think that if you're uncomfortable, it's okay. If you're comfortable, it's okay. But also knowing that don't be scared to have these tough conversations. Be prepared. Be humble. And listen.
Yeah, I don't know that I have much to add. I think I've done a lot of talking, but I just think this is I think it's something we're passionate about. I think it's something that is important for us to understand and through the lens of relationships. And I think the premise of some of this, especially for those of us who are Christ followers, is we want to become more and more like Christ. That's why we're called his disciples. That's why we're called followers of him, as we are following and learning from Jesus' example, which means it's not going to be easy. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're following a guy who literally gave up his life for us. Mm-hmm. And if we're to become more and more like him, it's going to cost us more and more of ourselves. Mm-hmm. And that's all through the New Testament. I mean, that's what we read. And so, I think when we engage in these tough conversations, when we engage with tough situations within our family or within other relationships. Again, part of that preparation key in some of this is how can I respond in a manner that's going to make me become more like Jesus. And when we, again, as a church, that's what our world needs. The world needs a church. The world needs Christ followers. The world needs families who lead with love, lead with humility, who lead with compassion, who listen well, and who soak things in prayer. Again, we talked about prayer last week, but don't undervalue the power of prayer in all of this. The reality is we have a broken world, and we can't fix it alone. We can't. It's through the power of God that fixes things. And if we don't include God in it, what are we doing? So, I think just continue to soak that in prayer, which leads me to an opportunity where we pray. So, would you like to pray? Would you like me to pray? You want to pray?
Lord, we come to you tonight after a week filled of heartache and sadness and confusion and frustration. We come to you with just our own things that may be going on in our lives, on top of the things going on in our society, within our city, within our nation, Lord. And we just lay them down to you, because that's all we can do, Lord. We can lay everything down to you, knowing that you have a way. You know what is going to happen, what's not going to happen, and we just lay all of our worries and all of our fears and all of our doubts. We lay them down at your feet, and we just pray that you just stay close with us, with our families, with our city, Lord. Just be with them throughout this heartbreaking pain, and just keep them close, along with our city, but also just our nation, Lord. There are many, many, many people just who are hurting, who are in pain, who need you more than ever. And I just pray that they turn to you, Lord, that they find you, and that they lay their burdens down as well. I just pray that as we continue to go throughout this series, that you bring to light all of these important things, not only within our family, but with any relationship, Lord, knowing that we're not all typical families. We're not all typical people. That you've created us, and you've made us to be our unique, beautiful, fearlessly made beings that are loved by you, and that we are able to understand that and believe that and express that in our worlds today, but always leading with love and compassion, and continuing to point people to you and helping people understand who you are and what you do in our lives, Lord. And so as we go to end this night and start discussion on the importance of hard conversations, Lord, I pray that you are with us in these hard conversations, that you bring us connected to each other, to listen, to pray with one another, to seek understanding and humility within these hard conversations. Just know that we are thankful for you and all that you do, and we pray in your son's name. Amen.
Amen. All right. Love you guys, and
Love you guys.
see you soon.